Okay, can people hear me? Oh, goodness.
Can people hear online now?
Well, I was just waffling anyway, so it's fine. But what I was saying was, as well as my terrible design, is that we've come to a conclusion in the feminist space that the drivers of the relationship between climate change and gender are very much structural, and they relate back to the overlapping crises that we're facing everywhere else at the moment around colonial histories and how they set economic trajectories for different countries, and how those economic trajectories are related to power in the macroeconomy, which has impacts on women and girls' lives. Capitalist extraction, so extractivism as a model for economic development, has impacts on many aspects of life, but when you study it at the ground level, it's often the most marginalized women and girls that are affected. Patriarchy, the idea that there are specific gender roles and societies should be dominated by male decision making, has been around for a long time, and it still has its impacts, even though we call them out and talk about them. And so there are lots of these different areas of overlap, which are in the outside, that affect women's lives, like just if I pick one or two out that are related to these overlaps. So for example, land tenure. So when you look at who are the most impacted at the ground level of slow impact or slow onset climate disasters, it's often small landholders working on farming, and the majority of those in many countries are women and girls that have precarious livelihoods. So as their livelihoods get impacted by climate change, they don't have the same social, economic, and political networks to bounce back. If we talk about water and food insecurity, when you study it at a household level, decisions are made within a patriarchal lens in many countries. So it's often girls and elderly women that get deprioritized when making decisions that are very difficult about who to feed in the house. So there's lots of studies that cover all these areas that talk about the impacts of these overlapping crises on women and girls. And what I've done for a long time is use this, again, very poorly designed diagram, I apologize. That just explains that this is a bit of a vicious cycle. So we have the causes and drivers of climate change, and we now know that, according to the latest IPCC report, that the colonial pathways, the industrialization pathways, and in colonization really drove a lot of emissions trajectories. The idea of extractive economies drives emissions. The poor progress on climate policies is also why we're here today, right? And a lot of those decisions have been dominated by male decision makers. The lack of historical responsibility for climate change is also can be related to gender in some analyses, because if you look at the main decision makers, leading states refusing to take on progressive climate policies, often you see men at the top. And male dominance in decision making everywhere at all scales has impacted the decisions that we've taken economically at national levels, which has driven the growth in emissions and the emissions intensive lifestyles that many of us live today. Then you have the impacts. I just gave a couple of examples, and there are so many studies on this. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into it, but I can share. I've got lots of compilations of the evidence, if that's helpful. There are quite a lot of studies that show that women and girls are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change in many different ways. And of course, this is intersectional. So the most marginalized women and girls tend to be the most affected. So those who are from minoritized communities, those living with disabilities, those who have precarious livelihoods, and so on and so forth. But overall, the understanding when you look at a society and how societies operate, patriarchal norms impact women's and girls' access to resources, decision making, power. And so when you have climate related disasters, fast or slow, you often will see, and this happens in many contexts, that it's marginalized women and girls that are most affected. Can you see me? Good. And one of the most used examples of this, we often like to use examples in the global north as well, because people often infantilize people in the global south and say, oh, well, poverty, and we have poverty in the global north as well. And one of the biggest examples of the gender climate nexus was Hurricane Katrina, actually, because the people who were most affected by that were Black working class women. And the reason that they were affected, this was in New Orleans in, I think, 2005, quite a while ago now, but it was to do with the history of urban planning in the city. And it concentrated working class people into the central districts, and then the richer people lived on the suburbs, and the richer people tended to be white and the working class people tended to be Black. And the hurricane hit right at the end of the month before the welfare check was coming in, and so many of those women, particularly single mothers, couldn't flee, and the wealthy white people just got in their cars and drove off. And so they were waiting for their cash, their welfare check, to be able to get out, and many of them weren't able to. And there's quite a lot of academic studies now which show that, once you're hit by a disaster like that, because of all the other areas of oppression that you might face within a context, you may never recover, and you just get hit by consequent disasters over and over again. And that's what we're seeing. It's kind of a race to the bottom, basically. The other thing that I think is really important to mention from a gender perspective is this notion of unpaid care. So I don't know how many people here growing up around their maybe female family members saying, I'm sick of this place isn't a hotel. Why are you making me tidy up after you? Why do you always expect food? Generally in the history of patriarchal societies, often it is women and girls who do a lot of the unpaid care burden. And that increases as climate impacts increase for some of the most marginalized communities. So in farming communities that are impacted by climate and it's affecting the crop yields, the first people to be taken out of school will be the young girls so that they can help with the household food security, for example. So there's quite a lot of discussion now about what happens in the context of climate impacts in terms of increasing the unpaid care burden. And that has a lot of knock-on impacts on the quality of life and opportunities that women and girls often have. Then one thing that I really want to point out that I'm going to talk about in detail later is debt. And I never thought I'd be talking about this. Honestly, it wasn't something I thought about until I was faced with it, which is we're in a global debt crisis and it's escalating really fast. So now there are the countries that are in debt crisis and moderate to severe debt crisis, there's 4 times more than there were 20 years ago. And when you're in debt crisis, you have limited fiscal space to spend on things like health, education, adaptation, social protection, mitigation. And when you have a disaster, particularly in those countries, you then have massive loss and damage, which has economic impacts. And that takes more of your fiscal space away. And so a lot of countries, because of climate change, are getting pushed more and more into debt. And there's quite a number of studies that show that when countries are in debt and they put austerity policies in, it's women and girls who get most impacted by those austerity policies. And then the third part of the cycle, so you have the drivers, there being patriarchy there. You then have the impacts compounding the existing marginalization that women and girls might face in a context. And then when it comes to the responses to climate change, and again, this is well studied and there are efforts to change this, but there has been, the energy sector globally has been very male dominated historically. That's changing, particularly in the renewable space, but it's been an issue. The decision making in policy spaces has been very male dominated. So there was a tally done about 16 years ago now of how many decision makers in the COPs were women. And they found, I think, 33% were women. And so there was this huge discussion at the UN level. And there's been subsequently like 62 gender related mandates. And then a tally was done again last year. And now it's 34%. So there's loads of efforts. There's a gender action plan, everything. There's an acknowledgement that we probably need more gender parity, but it's not changing because the problem is systemic. The final thing that's really important to say is that climate finance is not going to women-led organizations. Very few. It's hard to get exact figures because climate finance, and I'm sure many of you will know this, the way that it gets counted by governments can be quite dodgy. So they'll say they're giving a lot more than they really are. There's a lot of double counting. There are a lot of issues around how much actual climate finance is being transferred. But when the OECD, it does something called DAC markers, Development Assistance Committee. So it highlights all of the money that they transfer fairly transparently under the development budget. And with the climate one, less than 0.2% went to women-led organizations. So women aren't really making the decisions. I mean, of course, many of you are, and there are brilliant women in the space, but there's an issue there. Okay, and one topic that I got really interested in was the link between climate change and violence. and particularly gendered violence. And that was something I was working on when I was at the Grantham, was like the climate security nexus. But I really wanted to look at the gender perspective on that, because 1 in 3 women experience some form of violence in their life. And now our government here is saying that violence against women and girls is actually an epidemic. And, you know, it's fairly standardized across the world that it's a big part of women and girls' lived experience. So it's a structural problem. So if you have a structural issue like climate change, which is having lots of impacts on women and girls' lives, and many other people's lives, including working class men's lives as well, what does that mean for the existing violence that's happening in people's day-to-day lives? And so there's studies all over the world, but I'm particularly highlighting ones from the global north, because one of the problems I found with the climate security sector was a very colonial narrative, kind of like, oh, well, if it gets hot, then all the brown and black people will fight each other. And that was very much the undertone, and still is, in a lot of the narrative around climate security. Very kind of like, us white people in America and Europe are going to save these people because, you know, it's getting hot, and how are they going to survive? But if you look at like the USA had a study over a number of cities that found that there was almost a 5% increase in sexual offences in the 8 days following heat waves. In Japan, calls to ambulance transports and went up after, I think it peaked 3 days after a rise in temperature. So there is quite a big body of evidence showing the links between particularly rising heat, but other forms of climate impacts and gender-based violence. And there's a systematic review done under the Lancet Health. It was the Lancet Health Countdown, Lancet Countdown, which is quite instructive. I've linked there. And then there are these reports which look in a much more structural way at the gender, climate change and security intersections. I was quite involved in the one in the middle with the UN Women, United Nations Environment Programme. This was a few years ago now. Then this one on the left here from CGIAR just came out. So that has like some really recent research and evidence, which is useful to look at. And then IUCN did a really great comprehensive review of environmental linkages with gender-based violence, which, if you're interested in it, is definitely worth taking a look or watching some of the webinars that they've done, because I think they really outline all the different ways that the precarities of life and the challenges of life are being exacerbated by climate impacts. But like, how have I ended up where I am today? Because I'm now working on fossil fuels, which again, I never thought I would be working on fossil fuels explicitly, because I cared about climate impacts. As I was kind of progressing on my journey, it became clear to me that a lot of the work on climate, particularly in the policy space, is not actually addressing the root causes. So it's taken 30 years to get the words fossil fuels into the global climate negotiations. Like, the words were not even there. And I said earlier to Alina, please correct me if my stats are out of date, but the last stat that we have are that 86% of the carbon in the atmosphere in the last 10 years comes from fossil fuels. We also know that fossil fuels contribute significantly to methane. So why aren't we talking about the root causes? And that also applies to gender. Like, we're trying, but we're in a very interesting moment. I'm sure many of you feel the same, that there is a backlash obviously happening against progressive perspectives around gender and around democracy and decision making. But you know, I'm not one to back down. So I feel like you all know this, but you know, fossil fuel and industry are the biggest drivers of global climate emissions. But this is quite a useful diagram, which we show quite a lot. This is from the end of 2023. So I think this is produced by United Nations Environment Programme. It's called the Production Gap Report. So they look at the production of fossil fuels and what's the trajectory that we're on with regards to the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degrees, because the UNFCCC only looks at the emissions. So it looks at what governments say in their nationally determined contributions they're going to reduce, but it doesn't actually look at the trajectory we're on. And so by the end of 2023, we understand that countries are on track for producing 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than is actually compatible with our 1.5 degree target. So if we don't actually address the source, there's no way we're going to have successful, reach the Paris Agreement commitments. It's not possible. So, there's a lot of question of, are we, what's the word? Alienating the fossil fuel industry or kind of being too aggressive. And our point is we need to actually just talk about the source of the problem. Like, there are many, many people that work in the fossil fuel industry that probably eventually would like us to have sustainable energy, but they have no options right now because their corporations are not interested in shifting. And there's a very, very, very powerful fossil fuel lobby that invests billions upon billions every year in preventing us from actually dealing with the source of the problem. And as many of you will know, renewable energy investment is growing, which is good, but so is fossil fuel investment. So there's been actually barely any change in fossil fuel investment in the last decade. So it's not a transition. Like, we're talking about just transition all the time, but it's not a transition if we're still growing the problem. So it's commendable that we're investing in renewable energy, but also the majority of investment in renewable energy has gone to the global north and China. It's starting to shift, but so far less than 2% of all global investment into renewable energy has gone to the continent of Africa, for example, which has the greatest potential for renewable energy. Would you like to sit down? You're welcome. And obviously, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, has actually been talking quite explicitly, and it's hard to do that in a UN position, but he's been quite explicit that investing in fossil fuels is just, it's not only economic madness, but it's also moral madness at this point because of the impacts on people's lives, which are very studied. But the bit that I wanted to talk about, which is what has gender got to do with this, is this concept called petromasculinity. Has anyone heard that before? So you'll see this in some of the perhaps courses and PhDs on a very kind of more ethnographic, feminist geography, human geography side, but it's something we do note and talk about a lot, and it's very, very relevant for today. So this is this idea that there's a really strong relationship between fossil fuels and authoritarian patriarchal tendencies. And so many of you are aware of the drill baby drill, like, we won't be stopped, we're just going to keep drilling, and we're going to make all this money for our people. And there's quite a lot of research led by this particular scholar, Cara Daggett, and others since, that shows that the fossil fuel imaginary is very patriarchal, and the fossil fuel industry is also very patriarchal. But the people who champion it, they really play into the identity of masculinity in order to maintain this kind of momentum behind, like, why should we give up the energy supply that got us to run the world? Why should we give up our hegemony kind of mentality, which is very much the drill baby drill thing. So, there's quite a lot of studies I didn't have time to list here, which show that when you have more women in decision-making roles at ministerial level and at policy level, you have more positive or more green environmental choices and more sustainable environmental decision making, and this is probably something to do with it. The other thing to point out that we should be thinking about, and I think many of us are quite actively now, is the whole notion of an extractive economy, like the idea that you can just take and take and take and take from the planet in order to live the lifestyles that we want to live. And of course, the majority of the world are not living the lifestyles that we're living, right? The majority of the world are actually suffering the consequences of that. But the characteristics of the extractive model itself, so not just fossil fuels, but also mining, is that it's patriarchal. So it's designed for the benefit of men. When you look at extractive industries, they're very patriarchal. It's men who make the most money, men who make the decisions. There are patriarchal norms. There is experience of violence in those industries. They're neo-colonial, so they're built on the notion of extracting from the global south to benefit the north, and they maintain this economic hegemony of the north, which is very hard to get away from. So the whole, issue, which is very sensitive and hard to reckon with, the USAID cutting its funding, the UK government cutting its ODA budget, has caused massive ripple effects in the global south, which is awful. And part of the reason that that's happened is because they've been using aid for soft power for so long to maintain control over nations, and they have not created fair terms of trade so that those economies could thrive on their own and have their own power. That's not what the colonial model wants, and the extractive model is based on colonial thinking. And it's a complex web of power, which is very hard to unpick. You know, there's very little transparency. It's very hard to track down. There's a strong relationship between fossil fuel lobbyists and government positions, and they kind of move from these PR agencies to these government positions back to the fossil fuel industry. So feminist scholars and organizations have been saying, we need to now start talking about this as a structural issue. We can't keep focusing on the surface, which is like how many women showed up to the workshop. We need to be like unpacking the fundamental drivers and issues here around the model of economic development itself, because it doesn't serve anyone and it has particularly negative impacts on certain communities. So this is a project we did last year. The report is called Stop Fossil Fuels from Fueling Conflict. But the reason I'm sharing it today is to share that we're working with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and a number of women-led organizations and peace builders who have found over many years that there are very, very particular gendered impacts to conflicts that are tied to fossil fuels. And there's also a very close relationship between fossil fuels and militarism and conflict. And so we put this report out last year, but it was authored by predominantly by the women peace builders, which was great. And so this is something we're focusing on, not just from the perspective of emissions and the human rights impact of this untapped emissions trajectory, but also of the actual extractive model and how it operates itself. So if we look at gender justice and fossil fuels in general, the sector, as I said, it's like of all the sectors, it's got one of the lowest proportions of women employees and fewer in management. There are many case studies, but one that just popped out for me was Alberta in Canada. This province has like been mining for over 100 years, and it has some of the highest gender-based economic inequalities in Canada, and they're very much tied to the gendered structure of the fossil fuel industry. I mentioned the ongoing revolving door between corporate polluters, defence, federal government positions, lobbying, all of that. But the thing I didn't say was most of these people are men. And the introduction of fossil fuel projects, actually, as they're implemented, has been documented many, many, many times to have negative impacts on communities and on gender relations, particularly in Indigenous communities. But there's also issues around what are called man camps. Because when you start a fossil fuel project in a place, because most of the people who work on it are men, they put them in these kind of like communal living areas, and there's a lot of antisocial behavior, there's trafficking, there's sexual violence that tends to get drawn into the area, and local women will report heightened instances of sexual harassment and sexual violence. So there are many trends with regards to how fossil fuel projects are just implemented as well at a ground level. And then if we just take a step back and look at the link to fossil fuels and gendered violence in a broader, more systemic way, fossil fuel extraction and the conflicts do reinforce patriarchal norms in many ways. But one of them is that, you know, the experience of violence is not felt equally, and men experience violence, you know, significantly as well. It's not to say that they don't, but just because of the ability that they have in terms of their social networks or even access to a car, money, can sometimes give them the social protection that women and girls don't have. Often the people involved in the violence in conflicts, not always, but often it is mostly men as well, because of the norms expecting them. So that obviously has harmful effects on men too, which is why I talk about gender a lot. Gender obviously encompasses men as well. And so there are cases that are very well documented by civil society and local people that are just useful to be aware of. And where it becomes quite frustrating is the root cause of some of that conflict is multinational fossil fuel companies, often headquartered in UK, France, US. So if we look at in Mozambique, there's been an ongoing conflict in Cabo Delgado, which is about gas projects. And those gas projects are predominantly from French company Total. And what they've done is securitized the area, and then local people have been very frustrated about how that's played out, and this has triggered, and like there was already ongoing conflict with the government, but it kind of triggered more violence in that area and insurgency basically. And so there's been a lot of gender-based violence in that conflict, from abductions to trafficking and forced sex work. Some researchers also find that femicide, like the killing of women and girls, will surge after big oil projects are introduced into communities as well. So the militarism is something, maybe it's on a lot of our minds at the moment. Like global military expenditure is the highest it's been since 2009. So if you follow the climate negotiations, you're probably aware that like governments couldn't agree to put more than 300 billion US dollars on the table for what commitments they'd already made towards climate finance for the global south. It was a big issue at COP this year. But at the same time, they can afford to put down 2.443 trillion US dollars into military expenditure in 1 year. So it's quite sensitive because also a lot of that military expenditure is driving climate change and horrible emissions. And to be very clear, like emissions are nothing compared to human lives. So before I say what I'm about to say, that's very important. But the first 2 months of the genocide on Gaza alone produced more emissions than 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. So that's just in 2 months, not in the 18 months or more that it's been progressing. And as of 2024, the carbon cost just of reconstructing Gaza, and that's of 2024, right? There's been a lot more damage since then, will entail the total annual emissions of more than 130 countries. So it's quite hard to reckon with talking about emissions and there being no money when these decisions are being taken, often by men, sorry to say, not always, but often by men, that are leading to just completely blowing our commitments out of the water, which again is not as important as the human lives that are being destroyed. The other thing I just wanted to share was there's a strong narrative in the global south from fossil fuel companies that you should have fossil fuels. The North had it, why can't you have it to develop? Okay, I can understand that rationale. But if you look now, there's been some analysis on the African continent, and 90% of the liquefied natural gas projects that are planned in Africa are actually pitted for export to Europe. So Europe and North America. So that's why there are campaigns like Don't Gas Africa saying, we don't want to be your gas station. We don't want to be the gas station for Europe. We're supposed to all be transitioning. So I think I mentioned the links between fossil fuels and conflict. We've got a lot of data in that report, but there are just very strong, obvious linkages. About 25 to 50% of interstate wars since 1973 are linked to fossil fuels in some way. Now, this is all complicated. It's not so simple. Like there's multiple factors mediating these relationships, but you can't deny the existence of the fossil fuel question there. I also wanted to share, speaking about gendered violence related to climate and fossil fuels, that environmental defenders are being killed all the time. And this was quite powerful for me. Global Witness, who are based in London, actually, they do an annual tally of environmental defenders that are killed. Many of them are challenging fossil fuel projects and mining projects. And they put all the names together. It was 196 in the last count. And they disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples. And there's a particular gender nature to how the violence is expressed towards them. So women defenders in these spaces often face sexual violence as well. The other thing that I came across when looking at this was often the families of environmental defenders get targeted, and it's often the women in the families of the environmental defenders that get targeted. Why? Because of patriarchal norms around honor and shame and our bodily autonomy. And so we're also used not just as political fodder, but for people to express their violence to someone else towards us. So I think I've mentioned this. I can go on forever. Okay, debt. I really wanted to talk about, and I think I've kind of mentioned briefly why I think it matters in the climate gender nexus. And the reason I'm talking about it to you all is this year is a really significant year for debt because it's a jubilee year. So there was a jubilee year, I think 25 years ago, where global civil society and even the Pope lobbied to address the debt crisis. And now it's a jubilee year again because climate change is making the debt crisis way worse, and that has significant impacts on lots of people's lives. So as I mentioned, debt has skyrocketed. I'll share these slides if anyone wants to look at the numbers. Don't feel you have to actually look at them. But the important thing to say is that the debt stock is escalating every year. And what's also happening with debt is there's more players now. So it used to be just between multilateral development banks and some bilateral donors, but now there's more private sector creditors, and there's less transparency in the private sector creditors, and some nations don't share the terms that they make when they make deals with countries. So some countries are taking on deals that are very risky for them in the long term, but they feel they don't have a choice. And the borrowing costs are significantly higher for developing countries. So you get in debt, you try to get out of it, you get a loan, the interest rates are really high. It's the same for investment in the renewable energy transition, by the way. So the interest rates for projects across Africa is 15.6%. It's like a weighted average. The interest rates for projects in Europe and North America are like 2 to 4%. So it's much cheaper to transition your energy system here. And if you're trying to transition your energy system in the global south, mostly it's going to put you into more debt. And what's also happening is debt servicing is now becoming higher, is becoming like a major proportion of a government's expenditure, which is really scary. So there's quite a number of countries that over 60% of their fiscal space is being taken just by paying debt interest costs, not the debt itself, just the interest on it. This all comes from an UNCTAD report called World of Debt, by the way. UNCTAD has done some amazing work recently. So that's, yeah, they're spending more on debt interest payments than health, education, and investment in public services. Like, is that not quite terrifying when you think about it? And it's getting worse. And it's less than climate investment. So just paying the interest on debt alone is less than the climate investments in those countries are getting. So what happens when the debt crisis escalates is services for the most vulnerable, excluded, marginalized, and women and girls get shrunk. The first budgets to go are often, and under austerity, are often things that are beneficial to marginalized groups. So transport, health, social protection, access to some basic services, they disappear first. And so the people who are already in the power stratification, the people who are already marginalized, become more marginalized overnight. And so some of my colleagues are talking about that there's this kind of policy trap now. And the policy trap is when countries are in debt, what's happening is the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank will go to those countries and they'll weigh up how this country is going to get out of debt. And they'll say, you should just do new fossil fuel projects because you'll get this return. You know, the price of oil is this, and if you just do this for the next 10 years, then you'll get this return, you'll be able to pay off your interest. But what they're not taking into account is that we're about to reach peak oil in around 2029, according to the IEA. And when we reach peak oil, the cost is going to come down. So they're not going to make that return on investment in the long term because the rest of the world is moving to renewable energy and won't be relying on those sources anymore. So there's this huge phenomena of stranded assets that's understudied but is a big focus at the moment. So there's a lot of countries that are taking on assets that feel like they're going to have economic value now and help. And some of them are like 38-year contracts or 50-year contracts, by the way, to northern multinational companies. And then they're not going to be getting the return and they're not going to pay those assets off. And then they're going to end up in worse debt. And who are they going to end up in debt to? Like rich multinationals. It's just, as our colleagues who wrote this report on just transition in Africa, which was a very interesting one, it's a structural trap. I've got this diagram here which explains how the climate debt trap happens, but I think I talked about it before. When you have a disaster, your fiscal space gets wiped out overnight, then you need more credit to survive and thrive and to build back after the loss and damage. There's a really recent example from Hurricane Beryl in Grenada. Hurricane Beryl caused, I think, about over 30 billion US dollars of damage in Grenada overnight last summer. And Grenada, who were not doing fossil fuel investments before, then took on a 38-year oil project with the Nigerian oil company because they were in debt and they needed to figure out how they were going to get out of it. So this is a really big phenomenon in the climate policy space. Very, very, like a lot of focus on that at the moment. And I think I've shared already this part that austerity policies, like fundamentally, It's that trickle down. It's that idea of trickle down, right? But trickle down doesn't really work. And the people who are most marginalized in the structure are going to continue to be most marginalized when budgets get squeezed. There's some great work from feminist and debt justice scholars. I've listed some of their names at the bottom. But I quite like this quote, or I don't like it, but I think it explains it well, which is that austerity policies blend patriarchy with neoliberal ideology to further exploit the most oppressed people within society and deliberately dismiss their needs. It's not just a gendered policy, it's also a gendered process in its everydayness, the way it permeates the lives of women specifically in terms of their income, their care responsibilities, which get much higher, the unpaid care burden that I mentioned, their ability to access services as essential as health, water, and transportation, and their overall safety and freedom from physical violence. Let me just do a time check. Okay, I'm just going to do a couple more minutes, and then hopefully we can have a chat. So what needs to be done? There are many things that need to be done. I'm just going to share what I'm working on at the moment because I think it's interesting. And hopefully you'll be happy to know that this idea is being pioneered by a woman, my boss, Sephora Berman. I haven't put a picture of her there because she'd probably be horrified if I did that. But the idea actually emerged from many people, but she's kind of been driving it forward. So we have the idea of doing a fossil fuel treaty, a treaty that actually addresses fossil fuels very directly and in a way which is not necessarily alienating or pointing the finger at different nations, but saying we need to come up with a plan. We need to phase out of fossil fuels. And in order to do that, we actually have to talk about it. Like we have to address the elephant in the room. We have to come up with a plan that is fair and equitable. And that will involve different timelines for different countries to come off of fossil fuels. Because there are some countries like the UK and Norway that don't need fossil fuels anymore. And then there are countries that need to, a bit more time and they need technical and financial support to do it. So we want to risk those stranded assets that I was talking about because they also will create financial turmoil. So if you speak to any insurers and investors and like the people who look at the markets right now, they'll tell you that we're already in what's called a disorderly transition. And it's unpredictable and it's only going to have problems. It's going to create shocks and stresses that many nations and communities and individuals won't be able to cope with. So we need to plan a phase out, and we also need to help countries diversify their economies because fossil fuels are everywhere. They're in plastics. They're fundamental to the way that our economies are organized. So we also need to actually look at them and work on them together. So we have 3 pillars of a proposed treaty, and a treaty is an international agreement that's binding, basically. So a just transition that I mentioned, so planning it out with different timelines and offering financial support. So one of the things I'm working on is like, what are the mechanisms that a treaty could have that could disperse finance directly to countries in the global south to be able to plan their transition? So for example, one of our countries that's working with us is Colombia, and Colombia is the 5th biggest coal exporter in the world. The current government might change, but the current one wants to get off of fossil fuels, but they need support. So we're looking at how do we transfer investment because climate finance in the UNFCCC is taking a long time to come through. So there are different mechanisms that we can build in there. Non-proliferation, so an agreement to stop expansion. There are obviously existing projects, but an agreement to stop expansion. And yeah, like a fair phase out, basically, so the wealthiest nations move first and fastest. And here's a study we did where we looked at those phase out timelines according to like a number of markers, including which countries have the capacity to phase out now, which ones are the most dependent, which ones need the most financial support. And this is in a report called the Civil Society Equity Review, which was done by over 200 organizations working together and looking at the evidence together and saying, okay, if we were going to make a proposition for timelines, who has the most difficult transition, who has an easier one, who needs support? And what we've also done is we've looked at who has the most responsibility to pay for that transition. So based on different fossil fuels, you have different levels of responsibility. I think this one is on oil. So in this one, the United States has the biggest responsibility because of their drilling trajectory. The EU also has a large responsibility there. Yeah, and we've got quite a lot of support and momentum at the moment. These are different kind of the geographical breadth of those that are supporting us and people who endorse us. You can see this on our website. Happy to chat about it. But just one thing I wanted to share is that we're looking at other treaties as models. So we're learning from treaties that have worked, those that haven't worked, or those that mostly they work, those that even those that work will have challenges in practice. So we're talking to the people who are actually implementing those treaties now and learning from their experience so that we build that into what we're doing going forward. And that's it. Hopefully there are people are still awake. Yes? Questions? Thanks.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, one thing I've been wondering for a while is like how we can bring these like systemic structural perspectives to people in like STEM spaces. In particular, like I'm an engineer, we never talk about this stuff. It's always about like technical solutions to problems without talking about like structural solutions that need to happen or the problems that the technical solutions themselves have. Do you have any ideas for like how we can bridge those gaps?
That's a good question. I mean, I think what was really helpful for me, I mean, it's not a structural solution as such, but when I was working here, I had the opportunity to just engage with different like modelers and quant folks, and I didn't understand what they were doing. I knew it was good, and they didn't fully understand. And we had conversations and we had some joint projects. So I think joint projects is a really good place to start because you start to understand each other's way of thinking, way of working, and personal relationships count for a lot. So I think on a day-to-day level, that's one way to do it. And I think universities can do a lot more to facilitate that. I also think there are these kind of movement spaces. In the climate movement, we don't have enough engineers. We don't have enough physicists. We don't have, so like if I can, if anyone's interested in knowing about the events that we hold and how we get together, and like I would really encourage just more connection because I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do is create these like brainstorm spaces where we can figure out what we want to work on together collectively. Those are the main things that I can think of at the moment. Of course, like it's a big structural issue, but perhaps starting with a few great initiatives might create snowball effect.
The question is from Anna, which is asking, thanks for such an interesting and info-filled presentation. What is the timeline for the actual adoption implementation of the treaty?
Thank you. So treaties take different amounts of time depending on the political momentum that you have. There are a couple of treaties that went through super quickly. I don't want to say which one right now because I'm going to get it wrong. Maybe it was the Landmines Treaty. I think the Arms Trade Treaty went through fairly quickly as well. So it really depends on like the political moment that you're in. It could be anywhere from a couple of years to a few more years, basically. We're moving really fast and we're having a lot of conversations with a lot of governments. There's a lot of governments who are like close, but there's, power is very hard to challenge. And there's a lot of bilateral relationships between fossil fuel producing nations and nations that don't produce fossil fuels because they're depending on those fossil fuels for consumption and industry. So we have to basically build awareness that we're not, our role is not to what do you call it, lionize, or that's the opposite thing. I'm trying to think of the word for like point the finger at the fossil fuel industry, or countries that produce a lot of fossil fuels and make them feel bad. Is to say like we're in this together and we need to have legitimate economic proposals for them. So a lot of what we're doing is looking at how you replace fossil fuel revenues. And, part of what I've been doing is re-granting to researchers in different countries so that they can actually do original research on how do you transition Nigeria's economy, which is 92%, its revenue is 92% dependent on fossil fuels. How do they transition? And we need to be providing support. So it depends on how many of those good conversations we have and how strong the economic case is. But one thing I would say is like we're in a very specific moment And I think there's a lot of energy and need for new forms of international cooperation that haven't been there. Like there's a lot of exhaustion with the UNFCCC process, which by the way we support and we engage with actively, and we want it to work, but we also want to provide something that can help countries to plan and transition. So if you have any contacts in different governments that you would like to convince to join us, we're very open to that too. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm Rocio Diaz. I am a senior research fellow at the Center for Environmental Policy. And actually, this is a topic I have been working with for more than 20 years. I work on this topic mostly within the remits of bioenergy and bioeconomy. And actually, bioeconomy is one of the issues that are coming out, exactly to look at the substitution of many products from fossil fuel with bio-based, of course, products. So one of the things that we always find difficult is the funding, the financing for that. And the level is very different from the global north and the global south. But even in the global south, you have a lot of differences. So for example, South America is really much more advanced in that sense than, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa. But I also wanted just to mention a couple of things. It would be really interesting to catch up later and look for collaboration. We have a project here that is called Genesis, and actually it's related to the question that was made before, because in this project Genesis, we are looking at gendering energy pathways, the future of energy pathways. And actually we have found very little response within the university. We call for focus groups, we call for students, for lecturers, and I think this is an important aspect. We know, and for all the data you gave, we also know that there is a big mismatch in terms of gender balance in companies, even in renewable companies. I mean, it's getting slightly better, but there is a very big gap. The other thing, it's in policy. All the policies that we have reviewed in Africa, because this project covers Africa and Europe, are gender blind. Big issue as well. So it is who are the representatives in the governments, but also the policies. And in education, many of you may be here taking a degree, but you don't have anything that says gender and engineering, gender and biology. There's never anything like that. And this is something that we have been looking at again in these different countries. And one last point regarding the impacts of climate change or on all this, even renewable energy, I think, and I have given a talk on the myths of renewable energy. We tend to think that everything is sorted out on these terms with renewable energy, and actually it's not. There is a lot of displacement, it's particularly in the global south, for bioenergy, large crops, for wind farms, for large hydro, and we never talk about that. And of course, women and children are the most affected of all this. So there are a lot of myths also within the renewable energy sector. So maybe this is also an issue that we should be having these kind of conversations also on how to reduce these impacts on any of these projects, and really trying to look at how we can achieve a little bit more of this gender equality through these energy transitions. We are at that point, and unfortunately, I think that politically we are in a very difficult momentum with the proposal that you have, but we are still trying to look at how we can move it through also other different organizations, also with UN. So we'll be very happy to discuss it later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And one thing that I learned a couple of years ago, which again, you can work in climate change for 20 years, but it's such a broad space, you can also be ignorant to certain things. And I always assumed you can just replace fossil fuels with renewables, but you can't. Like, renewables are critical, but we also have to diversify entire industries. You know, our entire plastics, I think I said before, the entire plastic supply chain depends on petrochemicals, which depend on fossil fuels. So yeah, we have to be challenging our own knowledge base quite a lot as well. Thank you. I'd love to talk about your work.
Thanks so much for such a great talk. And I'm really glad that you talked about debt a lot as well, because I think this is really important. One thing that I feel is surprisingly not often considered a lot with debt is the other side of the equation. Who is the debt to? I think this is important because as the countries that are in debt are getting poorer, paying more in interest, and therefore spending less on their services, whoever's on the other side of that is getting richer and more able to, well, accrue more power and essentially promote their narrative. And I wasn't aware of the extent to which, I guess there's plans to try and promote fossil fuel projects in order to pay off that debt. And I'm wondering if there's been much work looking at the vested interest of who the debt is to and their relationships to fossil fuel companies, whether it's banks that have investments in them and so on. Is there much work exploring that?
There is, but not enough. So, and our own biases all come out in this as well. So there's been a lot of, so just for example, China has become a big creditor in recent years. You know, on many things, including particularly solar supply, which is great, but obviously what are the terms of those deals? But because of our kind of the Western inherent, like, effectively racism towards China, like we assume it's all bad, it must be bad, must be bad. And there's not necessarily analysis being done. It is hard because there isn't the same terms of transparency on those deals, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be. So yeah, there is a little bit of analysis, and I think some of the organizations that are very focused on debt, so there's Debt for Climate, there's Debt Justice Movement, Afrodad, Eurodad, LatAmDad, they do start to look at who the creditors are, and it very much depends on the region at the moment. And it's still, I believe, predominantly it's still multilateral development banks, but then you start looking at who the shareholders of multilateral development banks are, and you start to learn that there's a colonial spin, and also who works for those, and there's all that, you know, you start to step back and look at the structure of everything, and it becomes obvious that the power is cascaded everywhere. So yes, more work should be done though. Thanks.
Thanks for such a great talk. I noticed the other treaties that you showed were about mostly like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons. And those are government-owned things, whereas the fossil fuel industry isn't.
Yeah.
So is the first step nationalizing the fossil fuel industry in order to be able to implement a treaty like this?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think we've gotten that far. So some of these were government owned, but with heavy private sector involvement, right? Like the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, is that there? And the landmine treaty, for example. But what we are, I don't think we would have the power to demand the nationalization, but what we are going to propose that states negotiate are certain terms of transparency and regulation that would require some oversight of the industry. But it's really hard when you're trying to navigate a treaty because governments ultimately negotiate the terms. So they have to be aspirational and binding, and you can't push too much initially. So that isn't an idea that's come up, but that's something that I'm definitely going to take away and think about. Like we are like focused a lot at the moment on exploring national energy companies though, because national energy companies are not only critical for many nations' economies, but they're also like culturally symbolic. A lot of people work for them. They're important in the psyche of the society. So, you know, in some societies they don't like them, but we do need to be able to facilitate them to transfer into something else. And so, you know, we're definitely quite focused on that at the moment, but we haven't got that far. Thanks. I have time, but I don't know if the room needs to be vacated. Okay, sure. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'll make it quick for the interest of time. My name is Elsie Milan. I'm a PhD student at CP, and I'm also a negotiator for Article 6 for the Lebanese delegation.
Awesome.
So I can really relate, and I'm an engineer by, by training. So I
Yes.
can relate to a lot of things that you said. And just to reflect a bit on the national energy companies, I'm thinking, I'm from the Middle East, I'm from Lebanon. So I do understand a lot the different perspectives of talking about fossil fuel and the resource curse. We always talk about that, especially that with the new gas reserves in the Mediterranean, causing a lot of conflict. And to reflect on the point of national companies, Aramco still ranks among the companies that have the highest GDP. I think it's more than Apple every year. So this is something to look at. But my question is, are these treaties, when we think about them, like nationally conditioned? Because one country can use its resources in a way that could take it forward. I can reflect on Gulf countries today. Companies are leaving the UK, they're leaving Europe to go invest in Dubai, to go invest in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and this also creates like diversions. So are these treaties like nationally determined? Some countries follow the resource curse, others don't. Is it a problem of the resource itself, or how governments are using it? The second question is, shouldn't there be a redefinition of what the global north is and global south is with respect to emissions today? Like who should be held accountable for emissions and how? The third question is the lack of data and transparency in data. I work on market-based policies in my research. So talking about Africa, there's a big wide gap when it goes to, when we talk about Africa, we don't have resources available. So and happy to take the conversation.
No, thank you. And I hope, will you be in Bonn? Because I'm going to be there for a very long time. Oh, we'll have to meet for coffee because I'm going to be there for a very long time, and good conversations help you get through it, right? Okay. So usually with these treaties, they're negotiated between different nations, but they can have, well, what we're proposing is an equity lens. So, for example, there are certain formulas that have already been agreed within the UN system, so it wouldn't take a huge amount to apply them. So there's something now, for example, called the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, which has been agreed within the UN member states last year, I think, and that looks at countries, SDG, trajectory, debts, like historical responsibility, vulnerability, and all of those things. And what you can do is determine different categories of nations within those frameworks, and then that determines who has access to the finance. So let's say the UK joins our treaty. The UK is not going to be financially benefiting from it in a grant or concessional basis. Where it may benefit is there may be new terms of trade within the members that countries like the UK could benefit from. But from what I'm working on a lot is what are the financial mechanisms that countries will agree to, but that will be equity based in terms of their distribution, so that countries in the global south are the ones who can actually access that finance, and they access it concessionally. Because the one thing I didn't say is that something like 80%, don't quote me, but something like 80% of climate finance is provided in the form of loans, not grants, also contributing to the climate debt trap. And so we're trying to avoid those sorts of things. In terms of national application, with treaties, they have binding responsibilities, and as long as they commit to those particular principles and responsibilities, they can apply it, I believe, as they like within the national context. But there might be certain binding commitments. So, for example, we commit to not investing in any new oil and gas infrastructure. So if they were to then commit to it, they would be challenged within that context. Maybe they wouldn't have the same access to benefits that the other members would, because everyone's agreeing on a certain set of principles and commitments within that treaty context. But then in terms of how it's applied at a national level, it would probably vary. So because the contexts vary. So one of the things that I'm quite interested in is what are the mechanisms, and this relates to what one of our colleagues said earlier, how do you safeguard the transition? How do you ensure that investments are not displacing, even like big solar or hydropower investments are not displacing a lot of people? So you can have certain mechanisms that the nations agree to comply with, which could be around transparency, around implementing free, prior and informed consent commitments and things like that that already exist within the UN framework. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. But ultimately, it will be negotiated by governments. So what we're hoping is that we have a group of high ambition governments that really build some momentum around doing things a bit differently. Thanks.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
and answering the question, and thanks everyone for coming. Let's give a final pause.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Thanks so much.